Rain drummed steadily against the windshield of Daniel Carter's old taxi as he sat in the parking lot of the local grocery store. The evening sky had turned a deep gray, making the neon signs of nearby shops blur into watercolor streaks through the wet glass. He reached up to adjust his rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his tired face. A face that looked older than his early 40s. "You can do this," he whispered to himself, a ritual he'd developed over the years. Just another shift. For Lily. The thought of his daughter brought a small smile to his weathered features. She'd be at home now, probably sprawled across their worn couch with her textbooks, determined to maintain her honor roll status despite everything. Pride warmed his chest, pushing back against the familiar ache of inadequacy that haunted him. His radio crackled to life. "Gotta pick up at the train station, Carter. Lady needs a ride to the Parkview Hotel." "Copy that," Daniel responded, already putting the car in gear. On my way. The wipers kept steady time as he navigated the quiet streets of their small Midwestern town. Everything looked different in the rain, softer somehow, like memories wrapped in fog. He pulled up to the station, where a woman in her 60s stood under the overhang, clutching a worn leather briefcase to her chest. Daniel stepped out with an umbrella, despite the short distance to the car. "Let me help you with that, ma'am," he offered, shielding her from the rain as he opened the back door. "Oh, thank you," she said, settling into the seat. "The Parkview Hotel, please." "I'm Margaret Ellison." "Daniel Carter," he responded automatically, catching her eye in the rearview mirror as he pulled away from the curb. "Welcome to town, Mrs. Ellison." There was something in her voice that made him feel at ease. Perhaps it was the warmth in her tone, or the way she'd introduced herself so naturally, as if they were meeting at a community gathering rather than in his taxi. "Please, call me Margaret," she said, leaning forward slightly. "Are you from here originally, Daniel?" "Born and raised," he replied, navigating through the rain-slicked streets. "Never really left, except for college." He paused, surprised at himself for volunteering that information. Margaret's eyes crinkled with interest. "Oh? Where did you study?" "State University," Daniel said, his voice growing quieter. "English major. If you can believe it. Seems like another lifetime now." "You sound like you miss it," Margaret observed gently. Daniel's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "Sometimes. But life has a way of changing your plans. My daughter, Lily. She's my priority now." "How old is she?" 15, Daniel said, his voice warming naturally. "Smart as a whip, works harder than anyone I know. She's probably doing homework right now. She's determined to keep her spot on the honor roll." Margaret smiled, noting how his whole demeanor shifted when speaking about his daughter. "She sounds wonderful. You must be very proud." "Every single day," Daniel admitted. "Even when things are tough, she never complains. Just keeps pushing forward, you know. She's stronger than I ever was at her age." The rain continued its steady pattern as they drove through the familiar streets. Daniel found himself sharing more than he usually would with a passenger, about Lily's love of reading, her quiet determination, the way she seemed to find good in everything despite their struggles. "It sounds like you're doing a remarkable job with her," Margaret said softly. Daniel swallowed hard, shaking his head slightly. "I do my best. Sometimes I worry it's not enough, but—" He trailed off, surprised by his own candidness with this stranger. They were passing the high school now, its brick buildings dark and silent in the rain. The football field lights cast long reflections on the wet pavement, and Daniel could see a few cars still in the parking lot, probably teachers working late. Margaret had gone very quiet in the back seat. Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her staring at him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Her eyes had widened, and there was something like recognition dawning on her face. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand coming up to cover her mouth. "Daniel Carter, from Mrs. Ellison's creative writing class. Senior year." The story about the lighthouse keeper. Daniel felt his heart stop for a moment, then start again with a painful thud. He looked back at her again, really looked this time, and suddenly he could see past the gray hair and lines of age to the teacher who had once told him he could change the world with his words. "Mrs. Ellison?" he managed, his voice barely audible over the rain. In the back seat, Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She didn't speak, but Daniel could see them falling silently down her cheeks in the reflection of the passing streetlights. The weight of everything he'd once dreamed of, everything he'd let go of, seemed to fill the small space of the taxi like a physical presence. The rain continued to fall, marking time between what was and what could have been, as they drove through the quiet streets of a town that suddenly felt both smaller and larger than it had just moments before. The taxi rolled to a gentle stop outside the Sun Valley Motel, its worn neon sign casting a pale glow through the curtain of rain. Margaret sat quietly in the back seat, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Daniel kept his hands on the steering wheel, unsure what to say to this woman who had recognized him from so long ago. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, her voice steadier now. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable, Daniel. It's just seeing you here, like this." She leaned forward, resting her hand on the back of his seat. "You were my brightest student. Your writing had such power, such heart. I always imagined you'd be publishing novels by now, touching lives with your words." Daniel's jaw tightened. He forced a polite smile, watching raindrops chase each other down the windshield. "Life has a way of changing our plans, Mrs. Ellison." "Margaret, please." "And yes, life does change things, but that doesn't mean the fare is $12.50. Daniel said softly, trying to keep his voice neutral. Margaret opened her purse, but her eyes never left Daniel's reflection in the rearview mirror. "What happened?" "If you don't mind my asking." Daniel's fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel. The rain seemed to grow louder in the silence. "My wife passed away," he said finally. "Cancer. Lily was only 8 at the time." He swallowed hard. Someone had to keep food on the table. "Oh, Daniel," Margaret's voice cracked. "I'm so sorry." "It's fine, really." Daniel straightened his shoulders. "The taxi company offers flexible hours. I can be there when Lily needs me. That's what matters." Margaret pulled out a $20 bill and handed it forward. "Keep the change." She paused, then added, "I'm speaking at the First Methodist Church tomorrow evening. About second chances." She reached into her purse again and withdrew a small flyer. 7 o'clock. "I'd love for you and Lily to come." Daniel took the flyer without looking at it. "That's kind of you, but just think about it," Margaret said. She gathered her umbrella and opened the car door, letting in a gust of damp air. "Sometimes life's greatest chapters come after we think the story's over." Daniel watched through the rain-streaked window as Margaret hurried into the motel office. He sat there for a long moment, the flyer heavy in his hand, before finally pulling away from the curb. Later that evening, Daniel stood at the stove, stirring a pot of mac and cheese while Lily set the table. The kitchen was small but warm, filled with the comfortable clutter of their life together. Lily's school artwork on the fridge. Daniel's collection of coffee mugs lined up on the counter. "How was work?" Lily asked, placing 2 glasses of water on the table. "The usual." Daniel spooned the mac and cheese into bowls. "Though I did have an interesting passenger. My old English teacher from high school." Lily's eyes lit up. "Really? What were they like?" "She," Daniel corrected, sitting down. "Mrs. Ellison. Margaret. She was." He trailed off, remembering how she'd believed in him all those years ago. "She was kind. Did she remember you?" Daniel nodded, pushing his food around with his fork. "She invited us to hear her speak at church tomorrow evening. Something about second chances. Can we go?" Lily straightened in her chair, suddenly eager. "Please, Dad?" Daniel looked up, surprised by her enthusiasm. "Don't you have homework? I can finish it before then." Lily leaned forward. "Come on, Dad. We never do anything different." There was something in her voice that made Daniel pause, a hint of need that went deeper than simple curiosity. He studied his daughter's face, wondering if she was facing challenges at school that she hadn't shared with him. "Please?" Lily pressed. "I want to hear what she has to say." Daniel sighed, knowing he couldn't refuse that hopeful look. "All right, but straight home afterward. It's a school night." Lily's face broke into a wide smile. "Thanks, Dad." After dinner, Daniel stood in Lily's doorway, watching as she snuggled under her covers. Her room was a testament to their shared love of stories. Bookshelves lined with worn paperbacks, journal pages scattered across her desk. "Good night, sweetheart," he said softly. Night, Dad. Lily yawned. I'm glad we're going tomorrow. Daniel nodded, unable to share her enthusiasm but unwilling to dampen her spirits. He closed her door quietly and walked down the short hallway to his own room. There, on the highest shelf of his bookcase, sat a row of old notebooks, their spines cracked, their pages yellowed with age. He hadn't opened them since Sarah died, couldn't bear to read the words he'd written when the future seemed full of endless possibility. Standing in the dim light of his bedroom, Daniel stared at those notebooks. They seemed to stare back, like old friends he'd abandoned, holding stories he no longer had the courage to tell. The old church's stained glass windows glowed like jewels in the evening light as Daniel and Lily climbed the worn wooden steps. Daniel tugged at his collar, feeling out of place in his only dress shirt. Beside him, Lily smoothed her simple blue dress, the one she saved for special occasions. You okay, Dad? Lily whispered, her brown eyes concerned. Yeah, sweetheart. Just been a while since we've done this. Daniel managed a small smile, though his stomach churned with anxiety. They slipped through the heavy wooden doors into a sea of warmth and quiet conversation. The sanctuary smelled of lemon polish and old hymnals. Margaret's voice carried clearly from the pulpit, where she stood addressing the congregation with passionate certainty. And that's why second chances matter so much, Margaret was saying, her silver hair catching the light. Sometimes the most beautiful stories come from the moments when we think all hope is lost. Daniel and Lily found seats in the back row. He couldn't help noticing how some heads turned, how whispers followed them. In a small town like theirs, everyone knew everyone else's business. I want to tell you about one of my students, Margaret continued, and Daniel's heart skipped a beat. A young man who had such a gift with words that he could make you see the world differently just by describing a sunrise. Daniel's face grew hot. He knew what was coming, could feel it like an oncoming train. His name is Daniel Carter. The congregation shifted, dozens of heads turning toward him. Daniel wanted to sink through the floor. 25 years ago, he wrote a story about hope that brought our entire class to tears. I still have that story. I kept it because I knew this boy would change lives with his words someday. Lily's hand found his, squeezing tight. Her touch anchored him as Margaret's words washed over the church. Life doesn't always go as we expect, Margaret said, her voice softening. Sometimes it throws us curves that seem impossible to navigate. But the light inside us never truly dims. It just waits for the right moment to shine again. The congregation burst into applause. Daniel sat frozen, his cheeks burning, as people turned to look at him with encouraging smiles. He felt stripped bare, his private disappointments displayed for all to see. But Lily's grip on his hand never wavered. When he glanced at her, he saw tears in her eyes and a fierce pride that made his throat tight. After the service, people gathered in the church basement for coffee and cookies. Daniel would have preferred to slip away, but Lily steered him toward a corner where Margaret waited. Daniel, Margaret said warmly, reaching for his hands. I'm so glad you came. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. Tell everyone about. Before. Yes, I did. Margaret's eyes were kind but determined. Because that gift didn't go away just because life got hard. You're still that same person who could make people feel things with just words on a page. Lily, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. Dad, she's right. Her voice trembled slightly. I need to tell you something. At school, some kids, they make fun of me sometimes. Because you drive a taxi. They say we're poor, that you're nobody. Daniel felt like he'd been punched in the gut. Lily, why didn't you tell me? Because it doesn't matter what they say. Lily lifted her chin. I know who you are. I've seen your old notebooks. I've read some of your stories when you were sleeping. They're beautiful, Dad. You're not nobody. You're everything. Margaret touched his arm gently. Write again, Daniel. Not for fame or money. Write because it's who you are. Write because your daughter needs to see you, believe in yourself the way she believes in you. The drive home was quiet, both father and daughter lost in thought. After Lily went to bed, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, the overhead light casting a lonely circle in the darkness. He'd found an old notebook and a pen, but the blank page stared back at him like an accusation. His fingers trembled as they hovered over the paper. What right did he have to dream again? He was a taxi driver, a widower struggling to make ends meet. Writing wouldn't pay the bills or secure Lily's future. But Lily's words echoed in his mind. "You're not nobody." The blank page waited, both invitation and challenge. Daniel sat there in the quiet kitchen, torn between the safety of giving up and the terrifying possibility of trying again. The pen felt foreign in his hand, like a tool he'd forgotten how to use. His heart pounded with a familiar longing, the need to pour words onto paper, to make sense of the world through stories. Fear whispered that he'd fail, that he'd disappoint Lily all over again. But hope, that dangerous, persistent flame Margaret had rekindled, flickered in his chest. The blank page continued to wait as Daniel sat in the pool of light, caught between what was and what could be. The morning sun crept through the faded kitchen curtains, casting warm patches on the wooden table where Daniel sat. His fingers trembled as they gripped the ballpoint pen hovering over the blank notebook page. The house was quiet, except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of Lily getting ready for school upstairs. Daniel took a deep breath and pressed the pen to paper. The first few words came slowly, scratchy, and uncertain, like learning to walk again after a long illness. But as the ink flowed, something deep inside him stirred. A forgotten warmth, like finding an old friend. "Dad?" Lily's voice made him jump. She stood in the doorway, her backpack slung over one shoulder, staring at the notebook with wide eyes. "Are you writing?" Daniel almost closed the notebook, an old reflex of shame, but stopped himself. "Just trying," he said softly. Lily's face lit up with a smile that reminded him so much of her mother. She dropped her backpack and hurried over, peering at the page. "Can I read it?" Before Daniel could answer, a gentle knock echoed from the front door. Through the window, he could see Margaret's familiar silhouette, holding what looked like a coffee carrier. "Come in!" Daniel called out, his voice stronger than he expected. Margaret entered, her silver hair neatly styled, wearing a bright blue cardigan that matched her warm smile. "Good morning. I brought reinforcements." She set 3 coffee cups on the table, then noticed the open notebook. Her eyes sparkled. "Well, look at that." Lily grabbed her cup eagerly. Hot chocolate, Daniel knew, since Margaret had texted earlier asking about everyone's preferences. "Dad's writing again," she announced proudly. Daniel felt his cheeks warm. "It's nothing much. Just thoughts. Every masterpiece starts with a single word," Margaret said, settling into a chair. She pulled out a small paper bag. "And every writing session needs sustenance." Inside were 3 blueberry muffins. They sat together, sharing breakfast and gentle conversation. Daniel found himself relaxing as Margaret shared stories about her own journey with writing, the journals she'd kept through the years, the letters she'd written to former students. "Sometimes," Margaret said, breaking her muffin in half, "the smallest beginnings lead to the most beautiful destinations." Lily glanced at the clock and jumped up. "I'm going to be late." She hugged her father quickly, then surprised Margaret with a hug too. "Thank you for the hot chocolate." After Lily left, Margaret turned to Daniel. "How does it feel? Writing again?" Daniel ran his finger along the edge of the notebook. "Scary," he admitted. "Like I'm doing something I don't deserve anymore. Oh, Daniel." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "Words aren't meant to be earned. They're meant to be shared. They're already inside you, waiting." Later that morning, as Daniel drove his taxi through the familiar streets, he kept thinking about Margaret's words. His notebook sat on the passenger seat, not hidden in the glove compartment like usual, but visible, like a statement of intent. His first passenger of the day, an elderly woman heading to her doctor's appointment, noticed it immediately. "Are you a writer?" she asked, her voice bright with interest. Daniel almost denied it, but something made him pause. "I'm trying to be," he said finally. "How wonderful." The woman smiled. "We need more stories in this world. Especially now." Throughout the day, more passengers commented on the notebook. A businessman asked if Daniel was working on a novel. A young mother with 2 children wanted to know if he wrote children's books. Each conversation, though brief, felt like a small crack in the wall he'd built around his dreams. During his lunch break, Parked in his usual spot near the park, Daniel opened the notebook again. This time, the words came easier. He wrote about hope, not the bright, shiny kind from greeting cards, but the quiet, stubborn kind that survives in the darkness. He wrote about his passengers, their small kindnesses, their hidden stories. That evening, a middle-aged woman climbed into his taxi. She noticed the notebook, now filled with several pages of writing, and smiled. "My brother's always carrying around a notebook too," she said. "He's a journalist at the local paper." Daniel nodded politely, navigating through the evening traffic. "They're always looking for good human interest stories," she continued. "You know, real stories about real people. The kind that remind us we're all connected somehow. That's interesting," Daniel said, his heart beating a little faster. "Here's your stop," he added quickly, pulling up to her destination. The woman paid her fare and gathered her belongings. "You should think about it," she said kindly. "Sometimes the best stories are the ones we least expect." Daniel watched her disappear into her building, his mind spinning with possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to consider in years. The notebook sat beside him, no longer just a collection of blank pages, but something more, a beginning. The Bell Cleat Diner buzzed with its usual lunchtime crowd, the clinking of coffee cups and murmur of conversations filling the warm air. Daniel sat in a worn vinyl booth, his notebook clutched tightly in his hands beneath the table. Margaret sat beside him, her presence steady and reassuring, while Lily perched on the edge of her seat across from them, practically vibrating with excitement. Sarah Chen, the local newspaper journalist, slid into the booth across from them. She had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a notebook of her own. "Thank you for meeting with me, Mr. Carter," she said, stirring cream into her coffee. "When Mrs. Reynolds told me about your story, I knew our readers would love to hear it." Daniel's throat felt dry. He glanced at Margaret, who gave him an encouraging nod. "I'm not sure there's much of a story here," he said quietly. "I just drive a taxi and write a little." "Dad," Lily protested, "show her the one about the lighthouse." Sarah leaned forward, her interest piqued. "I'd love to read it." With trembling fingers, Daniel opened his notebook. The pages were filled with his careful handwriting, words that had poured out of him over the past few weeks. He'd written during lunch breaks, between fares, and late at night when the house was quiet. The story about the lighthouse was special. It was the first one he'd finished since starting again. "It's not very long," he apologized, sliding the notebook across the table. Sarah adjusted her glasses and began to read. Daniel watched her face anxiously, reading every micro-expression. His heart pounded so loud he was sure everyone in the diner could hear it. Margaret patted his arm gently, and Lily gave him a thumbs up from across the table. The minutes stretched like hours. When Sarah finally looked up, her eyes were shining. "Mr. Carter, this is beautiful," she said softly. "The way you describe the old lighthouse keeper finding hope in the darkest night. It's exactly what people need to read right now." Daniel felt his cheeks grow warm. "Really?" "Absolutely. Would you allow me to feature this story in our Sunday edition, along with an article about your journey back to writing?" The words hit him like a physical force. His story, in the newspaper, where everyone would read it. Part of him wanted to snatch the notebook back and run, but then he caught sight of Lily's face, her eyes bright with pride, her smile wide and genuine. Yes, he heard himself say. "If you think people would want to read it, they will," Sarah assured him. "Your words have power, Mr. Carter. They deserve to be shared." Now, over the next hour, Sarah interviewed him about his life, his return to writing, and his hopes for the future. With Margaret's gentle prompting and Lily's enthusiastic additions, Daniel found himself opening up about things he hadn't talked about in years, his love of storytelling, his dreams of becoming a writer, and how life had led him down a different path. The following Sunday, Daniel's story appeared in the newspaper. His words, printed in neat columns, looked different somehow. More real, more legitimate. The article Sarah wrote painted him not as a failure who drove a taxi, but as a man rediscovering his passion and purpose. The change was immediate and unexpected. Regular passengers who had never given him a second glance now asked about his writing. The lady at the grocery store stopped him to say his story had moved her to tears. Even Mr. Peterson, the gruff owner of the hardware store, gruffly admitted he'd cut out the article to save it. But the most profound change was in Lily. She walked taller in the school hallways, her head held high. When classmates whispered about her dad, the taxi driver, she simply smiled and said, "My dad's a writer." The words carried a quiet dignity that silenced the bullies more effectively than any angry response could have. One night, after a long day of driving and writing, Daniel went to tuck Lily into bed, a routine they'd maintained even though she insisted she was too old for it. She was already in her pajamas, sitting cross-legged on her bed with one of his notebooks in her lap. "This one's my favorite so far," she said, carefully marking her place with a bookmark. Daniel sat on the edge of her bed, touched that she was reading his stories. "Yeah?" Lily nodded, her eyes serious in the soft glow of her bedside lamp. "The characters feel so real, like you really understand them." She paused, then added softly, "I'm proud of you, Dad." Something warm bloomed in Daniel's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was hope, he realized, not the desperate kind that ached, but something stronger and steadier. As he kissed Lily's forehead and turned out her light, he felt it growing, taking root in his heart. Walking back to his own room, Daniel passed the shelf where his old notebooks had gathered dust for so long. Now they sat alongside new ones, their pages filled with fresh stories, new beginnings. He touched their spines gently, grateful for second chances and the people who believed in them. Daniel stood at the podium in the town hall, his hands trembling as he gripped the edges of his worn notebook. The evening light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Around 60 people filled the seats before him, their faces expectant. In the front row, Lily sat between Margaret and a few regular taxi passengers who had become friends over the years. Margaret had arranged everything, from booking the venue to putting up flyers around town advertising an evening of stories with Daniel Carter. The thought still made his stomach flutter with nerves. "You've got this, Dad," Lily had whispered moments earlier, straightening his tie. It was his good tie, the one he saved for special occasions, dark blue with tiny silver dots that caught the light. Daniel cleared his throat, the sound echoing slightly in the microphone. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice wavering before finding its strength. "This story is called The Long Drive Home." As he started reading, the familiar words flowed more easily than he expected. The story was about a father and daughter driving through a storm, both literal and metaphorical, and finding their way back to hope. He had written it late one night after a particularly long shift, thinking about his own journey with Lily. "The windshield wipers beat like a tired heart," he read, his voice growing steadier. Through the rain, the girl could see her father's hands gripping the wheel, strong and sure even when everything else felt uncertain. In the audience, tissues appeared. An elderly man in the third row wiped his eyes. A young mother held her child closer. Daniel's words painted pictures of loss and love, of stumbling and rising again, of finding light in the darkest moments. Lily leaned forward in her chair, mouthing the words along with him. She had heard him practicing in the kitchen late at night, had offered suggestions when he struggled with certain passages. Now, watching others respond to her father's writing, her eyes glowed with pride. Margaret sat perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap, tears streaming unashamedly down her face. This was the student she had always believed in, finally sharing his gift with the world again. And as they drove toward home, Daniel read the final lines, his voice thick with emotion. They realized that sometimes the longest journeys lead us right back to where we needed to be all along, to each other, to hope, to believing in tomorrow. For a moment, complete silence filled the room. Then applause erupted, starting soft and building to a thunderous wave. People stood, their faces shining with tears and smiles. Lily rushed to the podium, throwing her arms around her father. "That was amazing, Dad," she exclaimed, her voice muffled against his shirt. A line formed of people wanting to speak with him. A woman Daniel recognized from his taxi route clasped his hand, her eyes wet. "Your story. It's exactly what I needed to hear today," she said softly. An older gentleman patted his shoulder. "You've got a real gift, son. Don't let it go to waste again." Margaret hung back, watching with satisfaction as person after person approached Daniel. Some shared their own stories of loss and renewal. Others simply wanted to thank him for putting into words what they had felt but couldn't express. "I told you they needed to hear your voice," Margaret said when she finally reached him. "We all need reminders that second chances are possible." The evening stretched on, filled with conversation and connection. Daniel felt lighter than he had in years, as if sharing his words had lifted a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Later that night, as the last guest departed and the janitor began stacking chairs, Daniel helped Lily into her coat. "I'm really proud of you," she said, smoothing down the collar of his jacket. "You showed everyone what I've always known, that you're more than just a taxi driver." They walked home under a sky full of stars, their footsteps echoing on the quiet streets. Daniel felt a sense of possibility he hadn't experienced since before his wife's death. Maybe, just maybe, things were finally turning around. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. Daniel was still riding the high from the previous evening when he arrived at the taxi company's office for his morning shift. The dispatcher, Tom, met him at the door with an unusually serious expression. "Can you step into the office, Daniel?" Tom's voice was heavy with reluctance. The small office felt suffocating. The manager, Mr. Peterson, sat behind his desk, hands folded, face grim. "Please, sit down." Daniel's stomach dropped before the words even came. "I'm sorry, Daniel," Mr. Peterson began, not quite meeting his eyes. "The company's been struggling. Corporate's cutting back operations in smaller markets. We have to let go of 30% of our drivers, effective immediately." The words hit like physical blows. Each sentence that followed, about final paychecks, about severance pay, about how valued his service had been, seemed to come from far away, muffled and distorted. All Daniel could think about was Lily, about rent payments and grocery bills, about college savings that were already too thin, about how the previous night's triumph had turned to ashes in his mouth. He walked out of the office in a daze, clutching his final paycheck. The morning sun that had seemed so bright earlier now felt harsh and mocking. In his pocket, his phone buzzed, probably Margaret or Lily, wanting to talk about last night's success. He couldn't bring himself to answer. Instead, he stood in the parking lot, staring at the row of yellow taxis that had been his livelihood for the past 7 years, feeling the ground crumbling beneath his feet once again. The morning sunlight streaming through the kitchen window felt cold and harsh. Daniel stared at the layoff notice on the table, his coffee growing cold beside it. The paper trembled slightly in his hands as he read it for the 10th time, hoping the words might somehow change. Lily sat across from him, pushing her cereal around in circles. She hadn't taken a bite, watching her father's face grow more drawn with each passing minute. The only sound was the quiet tick of the wall clock and the occasional clink of her spoon against the bowl. "Dad?" she finally ventured, her voice small. "Maybe it's not as bad as—" "Not as bad?" Daniel's voice cracked. He placed the notice down carefully, too carefully, like it might explode. "Without the taxi job, we can't." He trailed off, not wanting to burden her with the harsh reality of their situation. The screen door creaked, and Margaret's familiar figure appeared. She'd taken to stopping by in the mornings lately, usually bringing encouragement and fresh pastries from the local bakery. Today, she carried neither. "I heard what happened," she said softly, settling into an empty chair. "The whole town's talking about it. That company's laying off half their drivers." Daniel's jaw tightened. "The whole town's talking, are they?" Wonderful. More material for their heartwarming story about the failed writer driving a taxi. The bitterness in his voice made Lily flinch. "Daniel Carter." Margaret's tone sharpened. "You are not a failure. Your writing—" "My writing won't pay the bills." The words burst out of him. He stood up so quickly his chair scraped against the linoleum. "My writing won't keep a roof over our heads or food on the table. My writing won't pay for Lily's college." Lily's eyes welled with tears, but she blinked them back fiercely. "Dad, please." "The newspaper article. People loved it." Maybe what?" Daniel ran his hands through his hair. "Maybe I can support us on dreams and good reviews? There's a factory 2 towns over hiring. Night shift, decent pay." "No," Margaret said firmly. "That's 3 hours away. You'd never see Lily. At least I'd be providing for her." Daniel slammed his palm on the table, making the coffee cups rattle. Unlike now, where I'm just... He gestured helplessly at the layoff notice. Margaret stood slowly, her eyes blazing with the same intensity she'd had in the classroom decades ago. Daniel Carter, you listen to me. That factory job is running away, and you know it. You have a gift. A gift? Daniel laughed harshly. A gift doesn't put food on the table. A gift doesn't... Stop it! Lily's voice cut through their argument like a knife. She stood, tears now flowing freely. Just stop it! You're not the only one who's scared, Dad. The kitchen fell silent. Daniel stared at his daughter, seeing for the first time how small and vulnerable she looked, yet how fierce at the same time. You think I don't know how hard things are? Lily continued, her voice shaking. But you're finally writing again. People are reading your stories. They matter to people. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. They matter to me. Daniel felt the fight drain out of him, replaced by a crushing wave of shame. Lily! Honey! No. She grabbed her backpack from the chair. I'd rather have my dad who writes stories and believes in something than someone who gives up because it's easier. She fled from the kitchen, the screen door banging behind her. Margaret watched her go, then turned back to Daniel. She's right, you know. What do you want from me, Margaret? His voice was raw. What am I supposed to do? Fight, she said simply. Fight like you did in my classroom. Fight like you did when Sarah got sick. Fight like you've been fighting every day since, driving that taxi to give Lily a good life. Daniel sank back into his chair, suddenly exhausted. I'm tired of fighting. Then let others fight with you for a change. Margaret's voice softened. The community reading touched people, Daniel. Real people. Your words gave them hope. Maybe. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Maybe it's time to let that hope come back to you. But Daniel was already shaking his head. I can't gamble Lily's future on maybes. And what future are you giving her by running away to that factory? Margaret's words hit him like a physical blow. What example are you setting by abandoning your gift just when it's starting to bloom? Daniel stood abruptly, needing to escape the truth in her words. I need some air. He walked out onto the front porch, letting the screen door close quietly behind him. The morning had grown warmer, but he felt cold inside. Behind him, he heard Margaret gathering her things, preparing to leave. Just think about it, she said from the doorway. Really think about what you're teaching Lily about dreams and courage, and facing hard times. Her footsteps receded down the porch steps, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. The day passed in a blur. Lily didn't come home after school, probably staying at a friend's house. Daniel couldn't blame her. As evening fell, he found himself back on the porch, sitting in the old wooden rocker that Sarah had loved so much. The stars were coming out, bright pinpricks in the darkening sky. He remembered how he and Sarah used to sit here, planning their future, dreaming about the books he would write. How had he strayed so far from those dreams? The layoff notice felt heavy in his pocket, a weight pulling him down into darker thoughts. The factory job loomed in his mind, steady, safe, soul-crushing, everything he'd always sworn he wouldn't become. But what choice did he have? Daniel rocked slowly in the chair, watching the stars emerge one by one, feeling more lost and uncertain than he had in years. The night air grew cooler, but he barely noticed, too wrapped up in the crushing weight of decisions he wasn't ready to make. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the living room windows as Daniel sorted through job listings circled in red ink. His shoulders slumped with each possibility: warehouse work 2 towns over, night security at the mall, custodian at the airport. None of them felt right. But they all paid, and that's what mattered now. The front door creaked open, and Lily's footsteps shuffled in. Daniel quickly folded the newspaper, trying to hide the evidence of his job search, but the look in his daughter's eyes told him she already knew. Dad, she said softly, dropping her backpack by the door. Her voice quivered. We need to talk. Daniel forced a smile. Sure, sweetie. How was school? Lily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled out a chair and sat across from him at the kitchen table. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and Daniel noticed her eyes were red-rimmed. I heard you last night, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. When you were talking to Mrs. Ellison on the phone about giving up writing, Daniel's chest tightened. Lily, honey, sometimes adults have to make hard choices. We need money. And writing. Well, it's not. No. Lily's outburst startled them both. Tears spilled down her cheeks. You can't give up. Not now. Not after everything. Lily, please. Just listen. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Remember when those girls at school used to make fun of me because you drive a taxi? They'd call you names, say awful things about us being poor? Daniel's heart ached. He'd known about the bullying, but Lily had never wanted to talk about it before. I used to feel so ashamed, she continued. But then you started writing again. You showed me what real courage looks like. When you got up on that stage at town hall, her voice broke. Dad, you showed me that it doesn't matter what other people think. What matters is being true to yourself. Daniel reached across the table and took her trembling hands in his. Oh, sweetheart. Today in English class, we had to read our essays out loud. Mine was about you, about watching you find your voice again. And you know what? Those same girls who used to make fun of me, they came up afterward and said they loved it. They asked if you were writing anything new. Tears burned behind Daniel's eyes as Lily squeezed his hands. You're my hero, Dad. Not because of what job you have, but because you were brave enough to try again. Please, don't stop now. A gentle knock at the door interrupted them. Margaret Ellison stood in the doorway, her kind face creased with concern. I hope I'm not interrupting? Daniel quickly wiped his eyes. No, come in, Margaret. She entered, carrying a folder under her arm. I've just gotten off the phone with Sarah Klein from the newspaper. Daniel's stomach clenched. Margaret, I don't think the response to your story has been remarkable. Margaret pressed on. Letters to the editor, calls to the paper. Sarah wants to do a follow-up piece. Lily's face lit up. Really? Margaret nodded, pulling out several papers from her folder. These are just some of the responses they've received. People connecting with your words, Daniel. Finding hope in their own struggles through your story. She laid the papers on the table. Daniel's hands shook as he picked up the first one. Dear editor, he read aloud. I've never written to a newspaper before, but after reading Daniel Carter's story, I had to reach out. His words about starting over, about finding courage in the darkest moments, they touched my heart. There are dozens more, Margaret said softly. Sarah wants to meet with you tomorrow. She thinks there might be opportunities here, speaking engagements, writing workshops at the library. Small steps, but real ones. Daniel looked at his daughter's hopeful face, then back at the letters. He thought about the circled job listings in the newspaper, about the long drives and missed dinners they would mean. He thought about the story he'd been working on just before the layoff notice came. Words that had flowed from his heart about resilience and second chances. I'm scared, he admitted quietly. What if it all falls apart again? Then we'll face it together, Lily said firmly, like we always do. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Remember what you wrote in your story at the reading? Sometimes courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and taking one small step anyway. Daniel looked between them, his daughter, so strong and proud, his former teacher still believing in him after all these years. The weight in his chest began to lift, just slightly. Like a ray of sunshine breaking through storm clouds, he took a deep breath. Okay, he said. I'll meet with Sarah tomorrow. Lily jumped up and hugged him tight. Margaret smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. And somewhere in Daniel's heart, a small ember of hope flickered back to life. The newspaper office buzzed with late afternoon activity as Daniel sat across from Sarah Chen, the journalist who had first featured his story 3 weeks earlier. Golden sunlight streamed through the Venetian blinds, creating warm, dancing strips of light across the worn brown leather chair where he sat fidgeting with his well-worn notebook. The pages were dog-eared and soft from handling now, filled with stories he'd written during countless sleepless nights after losing his taxi job. Coffee stains marked some corners where he'd worked late into the evening, his kitchen table becoming his makeshift writing desk. This one really speaks to me, Daniel, Sarah said, adjusting her tortoiseshell reading glasses as she looked over his latest piece for the 3rd time. Her fingers traced the typed lines with obvious appreciation. It's about finding strength in unexpected places, isn't it? The way you described that moment when your daughter defended you at school, it gave me chills. Daniel nodded, his throat suddenly tight with emotion. The memory of Lily standing up to her classmates still overwhelmed him. It's about my daughter, actually. About how she helps me be brave even when she doesn't know it. She's always been stronger than me in ways I'm just starting to understand. Sarah's fingers flew across her computer keyboard, her dark eyes bright with the kind of enthusiasm Daniel hadn't seen directed at his work in years. Would you mind if we publish this one online too? We've been getting lots of emails asking about you since the first article went up. Our website traffic has tripled when people search for your name. Really? Daniel's eyebrows shot up in genuine surprise, his pen stilling in his hand. I didn't think anyone would remember that first piece. I figured it would just get buried under all the other news. Sarah turned her computer screen toward him with a smile that reached her eyes. Look at these comments from our website. She scrolled through dozens upon dozens of responses to his original story, the cursor moving past paragraph after paragraph of heartfelt messages. People didn't just read your words, Daniel. They connected with your journey in ways that surprise even me. As Daniel read through the comments, his chest tightened with an emotion he couldn't quite name. A single mother from the east side of town wrote about how his story gave her the courage to finally go back to nursing school after years of doubt. An elderly man named Frank shared how it reminded him to dust off his old guitar and never stop believing in second chances. A teenager with the username BookGirl2023 said his words helped her understand why her own father worked so hard and why she should be proud instead of embarrassed. I had no idea people felt this way, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion as he continued scrolling. I just wrote what was in my heart. That's exactly why it works, Sarah replied gently. Authenticity can't be faked, Daniel. People recognize truth when they read it. Within 3 days of publishing his new story online, something completely unexpected happened that changed everything. The piece spread through local social media like wildfire on a dry summer day. Daniel's old flip phone, the only one he could afford, began buzzing constantly with notifications as people shared his words across Facebook and Twitter. The story jumped from the newspaper's website to personal pages, community groups, and discussion forums across the entire county. Margaret stopped by his modest house one crisp evening, clutching a thick stack of freshly printed emails in her weathered hands. Her silver hair caught the porch light as she smiled with barely contained excitement. The newspaper forwarded these to me since they know we're friends, she said, her blue eyes absolutely twinkling with joy. They're all for you, Daniel. Every single one. He sat at his small kitchen table under the warm yellow light, reading letter after heartfelt letter with growing amazement. People from 3 counties over wrote about how his words gave them hope during the darkest periods of their lives, how his story of starting over at 42 helped them face their own seemingly impossible challenges. One particularly moving letter came from a taxi driver named Robert in Pennsylvania, who said Daniel's journey inspired him to finally pursue his own long-forgotten dream of opening a small bakery. Listen to this one, Daniel said to Margaret, his voice thick with emotion as he read aloud. Dear Mr. Carter, I'm a nurse who works night shifts, and I read your story during my break at 3 a.m. I haven't cried in years, but your words about finding worth beyond a job title made me remember why I became a nurse in the first place. Thank you for reminding me that every honest job has dignity when it's done with love. At Lincoln Middle School, things were changing dramatically for Lily, too. She walked the familiar hallways with her shoulders back and her head held high now. Her father's printed stories tucked safely in the front pocket of her worn backpack like treasured talismans. During lunch break on Thursday, she overheard someone say, "That's Carter's daughter, you know. The writer who's been in the paper?" The whispers that followed her were completely different now. No more muffled snickers about her dad being just a cab driver or cruel jokes about their secondhand clothes. Instead, classmates approached her desk asking to borrow copies of his stories for their own parents to read. Jenny Martinez, who had once been particularly cruel about their modest means and old car, even approached Lily nervously after English class to ask if her father would consider speaking to their creative writing club about pursuing dreams despite obstacles. My mom read his story online and cried, Jenny admitted quietly, her usual confidence replaced by genuine humility. She said it reminded her of her own dad, who worked 3 jobs to put her through college. I never thought about it that way before. One crisp afternoon in late October, Daniel picked Lily up from school in their faithful old Honda, still adjusting to the strange feeling of not being behind the wheel of his familiar yellow taxi. She practically bounced into the passenger seat, her entire face glowing with an excitement he hadn't seen since before her mother passed away. "Dad, you absolutely won't believe what happened today." She pulled out a slightly crumpled paper from her bag with hands that trembled with excitement. "Mrs. Peterson read your latest story to our entire English class during fourth period. Everyone loved it. Even Tommy Wilson, you know, the one who never pays attention to anything and usually sleeps through literature discussions. He actually had tears in his eyes. But don't tell anyone I told you that." Daniel felt his heart swell with pride as he watched his daughter's animated excitement. This was so completely different from the quiet, defensive girl who used to hide her deep hurt behind brave smiles and fierce loyalty. The transformation amazed him daily. "And guess what else happened?" Lily continued, practically bouncing in her seat with uncontainable energy. "Mrs. Peterson showed our story to Mr. Rodriguez. And now the school newspaper wants to interview me about what it's like being a writer's daughter. They want to know how it feels to watch someone chase their dreams. Can you believe it, Dad?" Daniel had to pull their car over to the curb, his eyes suddenly misty with tears he didn't try to hide. He remembered all those long, lonely nights driving his taxi through empty streets, feeling like a complete failure, wondering constantly if he was letting Lily down by not providing more. Now here she was, absolutely beaming with pride to be his daughter. "I have something incredible to tell you too, sweetheart," he said, turning in his seat to face her completely. "The community college called this morning while you were at school. They want me to teach a creative writing workshop starting next month. It's a real class, Lily, with real students who want to learn." Lily's squeal of pure delight filled their small car and probably carried to the neighboring houses. "Dad, that's absolutely amazing. I'm so proud of you." "It's not much money yet," he started to say, falling back into his old habit of qualifying good news. But Lily cut him off with a fierce hug across the center console that nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. "Stop that right now," she said firmly, her voice carrying an authority that reminded him powerfully of her mother. "You always taught me that a person's worth isn't measured by the size of their paycheck. It's about touching hearts and helping others believe in themselves when they've forgotten how." She pulled back slightly, her brown eyes shining with unshed tears of joy. "That's exactly what you're doing now, Dad. You're changing lives with your words." Daniel stared at his daughter in wonder, suddenly seeing not just his little girl who used to make him crayon drawings, but his most faithful supporter, his strongest advocate, and his most important reader. Every single word he'd written since that rainy evening when Margaret first recognized him in his taxi had been, in some profound way, for Lily. To show her that dreams don't die when life gets hard, they just wait patiently for the right moment to bloom again. He hugged her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo and feeling her small hands pat his back comfortingly. "When did you get so wise, sweetheart?" he whispered against her hair. "I learned from the very best," she replied, her voice muffled but clear against his shoulder. "Your stories taught me that hope is stronger than fear, and love is stronger than anything else in the world." In that precious moment, holding his remarkable daughter close in their old car by the side of a quiet residential street, Daniel understood something profound that would stay with him forever. His worth as a man and a father had never been about the job title on his business cards or the amount of money in his checking account. It was about the hope he could kindle in others through his honest words, and most importantly, the example he set daily for the extraordinary young woman growing up in his arms. The late afternoon sun painted everything golden as they sat together. Two people who had learned that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin not when life is perfect, but when we finally find the courage to write new chapters. The autumn morning painted the town in gentle shades of gold and amber. Daniel Carter stood beside his taxi, polished one last time for this special farewell ride. His fingers traced the worn lettering on the door, City Cab, 247, remembering all the stories that had unfolded within. Margaret Ellison approached, her silver hair catching the morning light. She wore a warm smile and carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Right on time," Daniel said, opening the passenger door with an exaggerated flourish. "Your chariot awaits, Mrs. Ellison." Margaret chuckled, but her eyes held a deeper emotion. My, how things have changed since that rainy night. Instead of taking the back seat as passengers usually did, Margaret sat up front beside Daniel. It felt right. They were no longer driver and passenger, but friends who had walked a remarkable journey together. Daniel eased the taxi into the quiet streets of their small town. They passed the high school where everything had started, its brick walls now softened by climbing ivy. A few students milled about the entrance, reminding Daniel of his own school days, when Margaret had first seen something special in him. "I brought you something," Margaret said, placing the brown package on the dashboard. "Open it later, when you're ready." They drove past the church where Margaret had given her speech about second chances, past the diner where Daniel had met Sarah the journalist, and finally past the town hall where he'd done his first reading. Each landmark held a piece of his transformation. "You know," Daniel said, his voice gentle, "I spent years thinking I'd failed at life. Driving this cab felt like proof of that." He paused at a red light, watching leaves dance across the intersection. "But now I understand. It wasn't failure. It was just a different path to where I needed to be." Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening. "Sometimes the longest roads lead us exactly where we're meant to go." She reached over and patted his hand. "Your words are touching lives, Daniel. Every time you speak at those community centers, every story you publish, you're changing people's hearts. Including my own," Daniel admitted. "And Lily's too. She's writing now, did I tell you? Nothing serious yet, but she fills these little notebooks with stories." Pride warmed his voice. "Yesterday, she told me she wants to teach creative writing someday." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the familiar hum of the engine a soundtrack to their thoughts. Daniel remembered countless nights behind this wheel, exhausted but determined to provide for Lily. Now those same hours were spent crafting stories that helped support them both, not lavishly, but enough. "Thank you, Margaret," Daniel said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "For seeing me that night. For crying in my back seat." He smiled at the memory. "For not letting me give up when I lost this job." Margaret's eyes welled up, but this time her tears came with a radiant smile. "Oh, Daniel, I just reminded you of what was already there. You did the hard work. You chose to believe again, to write again, to dream again." The taxi rounded the final corner, pulling up to Margaret's house. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across her well-tended garden. Daniel switched off the engine, and the familiar tick of the cooling motor filled the silence. "This is it," he said softly. "My last fare." Margaret reached for her purse, but Daniel shook his head. "This one's on the house." She laughed, a sound full of joy and pride. "Well then, I suppose this is goodbye, to the taxi driver version of you at least." They stepped out into the crisp morning air. Margaret hugged him tightly, then pulled back to look him in the eye. "You know, that night in the rain, I cried because I thought you'd lost your way. Today, I'm smiling because you found it." After dropping off the taxi at the depot one last time, Daniel walked home, Margaret's package tucked under his arm. The autumn air felt fresh with possibility. Children played in leaf piles on front lawns, their laughter carrying on the breeze. When he reached his house, Lily was already home from school, sitting on the porch steps with a notebook in her lap. She looked up as he approached, her face breaking into a wide smile. "Is it done?" she asked. "No more late-night taxi shifts?" Daniel sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "No more taxi shifts," he confirmed. "Just writing shifts now." Lily leaned her head against him as they gazed at the horizon together. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of hope. Soft pinks and gentle oranges that promised tomorrow would bring new stories, new chances, new dreams. He thought about the notebook in Lily's lap, filled with her own budding stories. He thought about the speaking engagement scheduled for next week at the community college, and the small but growing stack of letters from readers who said his words had touched their hearts. It wasn't fame or fortune, but it was something better. It was purpose. They sat together in comfortable silence, father and daughter, watching the day fade into evening. The porch light clicked on automatically, casting a warm glow around them. In that moment, Daniel felt the full weight of their journey. Not just his own transformation from taxi driver to writer, but their shared path from survival to living. The hope that filled him now wasn't the flashy kind that promised instant success or dramatic change. It was steady and deep, like the foundation of their small house, like Lily's hand in his, like the words that flowed onto paper each night. It was the kind of hope that could weather storms and sustain dreams, the kind that Margaret had seen in him all along. What do you think Margaret left for Daniel? A manuscript of his old stories? A letter that changes everything? Or something even deeper? Let us know your theories in the comments. And while you're here, click on the next video for the continuation. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this, and join our growing family of hope-filled hearts. My dear friends, thank you for spending these moments with Daniel, Lily, and Margaret. Your presence here matters more than you know. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what part of Daniel's journey spoke to your own heart. Share it in the comments, because your reflections inspire others too. If you believe the world needs more stories of hope, second chances, and the power of ordinary lives to shine, please subscribe and follow along. We're building something beautiful together. Until we meet again in the next story, remember this: you are seen, you are valued, and your story still matters. Take hope with you into tonight, and let it carry you into tomorrow.